Hello, folks, and welcome to another Hangouts and Headlines. Hopefully, my voice holds throughout this episode, because if you can't tell, I've been sick this week, and realistically, this is the first time I've even been able to consider doing a video for you all. So with that said, I may have to clear my throat a couple of times during this episode, hopefully not too much, but otherwise, I am looking forward to discussing with you something of no import at all, and that is, of course, the U.S. presidential election of 2024. And as you might know, I'm being sardonic, but this particular topic is one in which YouTube and social media in general takes a particular interest. So if you were with us last week when YouTube unceremoniously took me offline 5 minutes into the broadcast, I'm hopeful that that does not happen this week, but I can make no promises. So I will ask my wife, who's sitting in the other room, to yell at me if I'm just suddenly clicked off the internet. And otherwise, if you can't hear me, or if you're having difficulty with this video, please let me know in the chat, because I did my best to set the buttons correctly, but you never know what you don't know, and it's always kind of a guesswork situation when you're putting out content on the internet. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited to talk with you all about how the media reports on things like the U.S. presidential election and why we need to be even more cautious in how we read things and how we take those truths into ourselves to make determinations on our own for our political or other reasons in a situation like a national election, whether in the United States or elsewhere. So let me know how you're doing. Let me know where you're chatting in from, what time zone you're in, how you're feeling about this election, how you're feeling about election advertisements in general. And then we'll get into the main topic of our conversation, which is Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast on earth, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and more. So get excited about that, folks. We'll be doing that in about a half hour. Otherwise, let me know how you're doing, and I will happily highlight the comments that I receive. Sitherindil says, so good to see these slowly becoming more regular. Please take care, though. Health first, always. Absolutely. I have been doing my best to basically take it down completely to low rest levels to get better from what I was really sick this past weekend. And this is really the first time that I could even consider doing one of these. So I am trying my best to not go full workaholic, but I wanted to have this conversation with you all, and I thought now was a good time to do it. So thank you so much. And Against the Tide, our wonderful moderator here, reminding folks that, yes, reasonable minds can differ. I expect that reasonable minds will differ on various aspects of this conversation. This is not going to be a conversation where I tell you to vote one way or the other on these things, but you are going to see people discussing topics that are probably going to be pretty sensitive or that you're very passionate about vis-a-vis politics. So I've got a Nightbot message on for when we talk about political adjacent things, but otherwise, just remember, reasonable minds can differ. In general, we try to cultivate a conversation and community here that allows for reasonable minds to differ. So please refrain from any ad hominem attacks or anything else, and take it as a good faith argument one way or the other when people make comments or comment to videos like this if you're watching this after we did the live show. So thank you so much. I do agree, Tide, reasonable minds can differ. And in fact, I'm working on a new format for a show that might be entitled that in the near future. But I don't want to say too much on that because we are well away from that becoming a physical thing that you can watch. So please do keep an eye out on this channel for a new type of show that may or may not come into being in the near future. And of course, Kurt, bringing the reality, all reasonable minds agree with me. I do think that that is a natural thing for people to think. And I think it's one of the reasons why you get such passionate discourse online. Hey, I've thought about these things. Hey, I'm reasonable. If you're disagreeing, you must be disagreeing in bad faith. I don't want us to slip specifically into that concept. And I know Kurt is just joking here in his comment, but that's part of why it becomes such an issue on the internet. Brentwood Chic, being a member for 2 years. Thank you so much, Brentwood Chic. 2 years supporting Hoeg. Hashtag shrimp fried rice. Yes, shrimp fried rice, the election issue that matters the most. Absolutely. Hashtag it, send it out there, get it trending. Shrimp fried rice. Chris Smith says, I stopped watching Rogan as I drifted off to other podcasts that I feel do a better job than him, in my opinion. Yeah, and I certainly think that just being the most popular or most successful commenter on any given thing doesn't make you the best, doesn't make you the most nuanced, the most useful. because popularity is not the only metric that we can judge these things on. But certainly it is the case that he has a huge audience and can reach a lot of people in one fell swoop. And that's part of the conversation we're going to have today. But yeah, I'm certainly not as popular as Joe Rogan. And I'd like to think some of my takes are more nuanced or more useful than his on various topics. And yet, again, not within a ballpark, not within the league, not within the solar system of the Joe Rogan Experience's numbers. Against Tide asks, are you excited for the TTRPG tomorrow? Well, I haven't gotten to actually promo that yet, Tide, but we will at the end of this video. So please hang on for that, folks. If you like Lawyers and Dragons, we do have a fun announcement if you haven't seen it online already. Nishay Jones says, hello, Hoeg Law. Hope all is well at Hoeg House. Watching from a cloudy, rainy Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one of the major fighting states in the election this year. Pennsylvania, of course, is going to be a hotbed of conversation come next Tuesday night or later. And so I wish you well, Nishay Jones. I'm sorry it's cloudy and rainy, but I do like October rain. I do like November rain, of course, to quote just an absolute classic song that I'm sure all of the kids know very well. So thank you for chatting in. Terry Zaslecki, I butchered that, I'm sure. Thank you for the super sticker, which is a lemon, I think, with a big heartbeat, which probably should have its blood pressure checked with that heartbeat. But I really appreciate the sticker, Terry. So thank you so much. Alexandra asks, Lawyers and Dragons? Yes, we have a conversation topic, not on this channel, that we will have towards the end of this video. If you don't know, you should pop into Ian Runkle of the Bailey's YouTube channel to see what he's got planned for, about tomorrow. And we will talk on it further as part of this video. Kimberly Rudd says, don't forget to vote if you are eligible here in the United States, presumably. And yes, I do recommend that folks vote. I would also add on this particular topic that it becomes a fighting point online, but no particular politician is owed your vote, right? Whether it's Trump or Harris or Stein or fill in whoever you're thinking about vis-a-vis politics, presidential elections, proposals in your particular locality. Nobody is owed your vote if you don't feel that they're going to represent you in the way that you would like them to be in their office. You don't owe them a vote, and you're not throwing away your vote to vote for someone that you think is a better match for representing you in whatever it is that you're looking for. But that said, you should absolutely vote. You should use the franchise that the government has deigned to afford you on these types of things, because that's the best way to start seeing governance reflect what it is that you want to see reflected. Britt Cormier says, I listen to a lot of podcasts. However, I will say Rogan is a bit unique most days because he's really not interviewing as my generation knows it. It's not a series of prepared questions. And that makes sense to me. I've only popped in from time to time. Let's get a disclaimer out of the way here early in the video. I'm not a Joe Rogan fan. And that I don't mean that colloquially. I don't mean that I am someone that doesn't like Joe Rogan. I mean that I'm specifically not a fan of his. I don't seek him out. I really only know him from News Radio, which is a very old sitcom. But it was a sitcom that I really enjoyed back in the proverbial day. And I don't listen to his podcast. I don't have any real thoughts about whether he's good or bad at what he does. But people are going to have certain thoughts about that. And I do think that Britt offers a good perspective here. I've heard this from other folks that essentially he's trying to have what amounts to an informal conversational style in his space and give people a certain amount of freedom to go in various directions, go on various tangents, to have that kind of conversation that you might have in the living room of your own home. And that's a style. I think that is an interviewing style, but certainly it's not the same kind of interviewing style that you would ascribe to something like 60 Minutes or something where you've got the two seats, you've got a series of prepared questions, you've got things that are designed to be gotchas or otherwise trick the interviewee in certain respects. I think that this is a very different kind of model. I think it's a model that works better in the 21st century where kind of authenticity and conversational nature is better received by the broader swath of audience. But it isn't the only way that you can interview people, and it certainly can make certain folks uncomfortable, all of which is going to be a part of the conversation here when we get to talking about the main topic here. So, yes. Carrie says, yes, vote. Voting is a privilege. Vote no matter who you vote for. Yes, voting is a privilege insofar as the government deigns to give us to us. It's a right insofar as we might think about our individuality and rights as humans. But yes, Carrie, I agree. Vote no matter who you vote for. Vote to see what you want to see in those offices. And don't let the social media, don't let Hoeg, don't let anybody else tell you how to feel about certain things, certain issues that are important to you. Get the facts as best as you can get them. That's a part of why we have Hangouts and Headlines, is to talk about how the media reports on things. But don't feel like you are owed to vote in one specific direction or another if somebody doesn't match up with what you're looking for. Nashay Jones says, I'm not a fan of Joe Rogan. His views are a lot for me. Let's say my lived experience, and therefore my vote is very different. I think that's entirely fair. I think that no one person is likely to be a perfect match for how any other person sees the world in its entirety. Right. And that's why I always recommend, don't just stick with Hoeg. Don't just stick at virtual reality, virtual legality. I can say the name of my own show. Believe me. Hangouts and Headlines, the Joe Rogan Experience, or anywhere else. Get those multiples of perspectives. That's very, very useful. I really found this out even more than I already believed in going to therapy after my stroke in the past couple of years, because it's natural for folks, including myself, to think that they have sussed out every possible perspective, every possible angle, every possible solution to whatever it is they're thinking about. And I certainly fall into that particular mode of thinking quite often. But going to see a good therapist, going to see a good pastor, anybody else that can actually reflect on what you're telling them and give you a different perspective is super useful, because you're otherwise locked into the way that you think about things, which is fine. That's how we operate as human beings. But getting that other perspective is super useful. And so I do recommend folks to check out podcasts, to check out TV shows, even if we talk about them here in Hangouts and Headlines and say, well, that's awfully biased, that's awfully editorialized, whatever it might be, because that is the best way to get those other perspectives and to think about things differently. And I will tell you straight up that I think about things differently now than I did 2 years ago. And that is largely in part of taking in other perspectives. And I would definitely recommend for everyone to do the same as best they can. Brentwood Chic, thank you so much for gifting the 10 Hoeg Law memberships. As I've said before, and I will continue to say, I can't have these conversations. I can't keep the lights on. I can't keep the family fed without support from viewers, listeners, commenters, whatever you might be, like you. And so I really, really appreciate all the efforts that people do to help keep this channel in existence, because I think we're doing good work here. I think we're having important conversations here. But yeah, it has been a struggle the last 2 years, as you can imagine. And every single little bit of support helps so much. So thank you, Brentwood Chic. All right. Continuing on here. Carrie says, I find Rogan's podcasts what I call abusively long. I would rather use that time for something more productive or have something more enjoyable as background noise. Yeah, I think I mostly listen to podcasts when I do as background to something else that I am doing. Very often walking, exercise, whatever it might be. And certainly if you don't like the sound of the podcaster's voice or the way that they approach interviews, that's not great background noise for you. Gabriel Morado says the best comment about the Rogan show was the person on X who described it as a caveman trying to understand complex subjects. Well, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think, honestly, the smartest people I know ask a lot of questions that a lot of folks that maybe aren't as smart as the smartest people I know would deem to be dumb questions, right? I will always tell folks, be curious. Don't assume that the answer to whatever you're thinking is obvious, and don't assume that it casts you in a bad light. Certainly for me, I view people that ask questions that others think are as stupid as curious folks that are trying to find out information for themselves. And I do think if we're being generous to the Joe Rogans of the world, then his interview style does, at least in the clips that I have watched, seem to come from that kind of angle. I'm going to ask a stupid question because I don't care how I look about it, and I'm going to learn more information that way. I do like that methodology. I do think too many of us are too concerned about looking stupid. And I will tell you that the people that are really smart do not think that asking stupid questions look stupid. Gamer Foxart says, not even me and my boyfriend of 5 years view the world the exact same. Not even me and my wife of more than 5 years. We'll go with that. We both are different, but also similar, but we learn to compromise and understand. Well, and that's the human experience, right? There isn't anybody. Your identical twin is not going to see the world exactly the same way that you do. And when I say reasonable minds can differ, the realistic kind of throughput of that phrase for me is the notion that just because somebody differs doesn't make them an unreasonable mind, right? And that's the tricky part for folks, because you do want to say, hey, I've thought about all these things. And if you are really adamant against whatever my perspective is on an issue of some importance, I'm inclined to assume you're acting in bad faith. But that's realistically not always or even the majority of the cases that I see online or otherwise. There are lots of people that can, with good faith, believe that the government should operate in a way that differs from how you think it should operate, that society should structure itself in a way that is different from the way that you think it should structure itself, and still want the best for humanity or still want the best for the world, and are reasonable minds in that fashion, even though they are essentially your adversary on these particular political topics where it's really one or the other. But they're still human beings, and we can still treat them as such. And if you're inclined to have society reflect your personal perspective, then persuasion, treating people with the humanity they deserve, is the better way to go about doing that. Nishay Jones asks, did you not see a therapist regularly before? I did not. I'd never seen a therapist in my life before my stroke. You were a whole adult person before you saw a therapist regularly? I mean, I don't know. Reasonable minds can differ on how adult or good I was before the stroke and my therapy. But yes, I came out of the childhood, adolescence, grad school, law school, lawyer, big law process relatively unscathed. I am blessed in that way. But I'm certainly the beneficiary of a fantastic therapist who, every time I go in and speak with her, says something where I say, yeah, that's right. But why didn't that thought ever pop into my head in that particular way? And so I continue to be amazed by that process when it works. And absolutely, I have no doubt that there are bad therapists out there. One of the things that always comes up in my head when I'm in therapy, when I'm talking to my therapist, is that like this is a really dangerous, really vulnerable type of activity that you could use my vulnerability here against me if you were an untrustworthy or bad actor. So I understand that vulnerability. I feel that trust as part of that relationship. I'm very glad to say that my therapist is fantastic, and I would recommend her to everybody I know. All right, we're just about to get started on the main topic, the main event, the center circle, the squared circle. I can't remember all the terms for various things here. Perceptions of Reality says, I bite my tongue when politics is brought up by certain family members. Yep. I listen and try to focus on things that we agree on. Sad that we don't agree on the solutions. Absolutely. I understand how frustrating it can be when you think, I have thought about all these things. I have a good perspective on how X or Y or Z should function. And why don't you just agree with me? I get that. I get that frustration. I get that even in certain of my comments to my videos. I am doing my very, very best to put out what I think is good information, hopefully educational, informational videos like this one. And people will come in sometimes and just accuse me of bad faith. And I hate that. That is like my least favorite kind of position to be put in, because I feel like I am operating with as good faith as possible in these contexts. But I also understand that folks are really adamant about whatever they believe on this topic or another. Kelly C says, I think people are closer on what they want, but language is a big hurdle they can't get around. Actually, as I mentioned earlier in this video, one of the things that I am thinking about doing with a new video series is talking about the nature of folks using words differently and speaking across each other in a fashion that is really deleterious, really harmful to the conversation, and that a lot of folks don't even realize that they are doing it. So I do want to talk about issues just like that, Kelly C., but we will see whether or not that comes into being. I don't want to make promises that I can't keep. And certainly one of the things I've tried to do in October that I think I really succeeded at, and I'm going to continue to try to do throughout the rest of the year and beyond, is get to a place where I'm putting out a video or two a week, including the Bitcast, including the Hangouts and Headlines, the Virtual Legalities, and including my appearances on Last Stand Media. And so I'm really trying to be out there more, being more a part of this community and doing things on the video space and in the commentary space that I think are helpful and useful, because I want to do those things, but I don't want to make promises that I can't keep. B19 says, I always recommend people do their own research and come to their own conclusions, not to follow along with anyone else. I think that's right? I think that I did my own research has come under a certain amount of attack online because there are bad actors that tend to use that to fight against things that probably shouldn't be fought against on a kind of objective level. But absolutely, for things that are subjective, politics, evaluating people's character, whatever it might be that needs to be done, you should absolutely not only do your own research, but try to get different perspectives on these various important topics, because nobody is unbiased, right? And you can try to be objective. You can try to be as cognizant of your biases as possible. I like to think we do that here, but I'm biased. You're biased. The person next door on the next channel is biased. That's just the way it works as a human being in our experience. And so it's useful to get multiple different perspectives to essentially triangulate where the objective reality might be, what it is that is most concerning to you as opposed to me. Britt Cormier says, Hoeg, if you're going to talk about language like that, you should also tackle the specific date issue when they say things like on December X, the economy was better, but skip that it was a spike. Well, I mean, I don't want to get into a very long conversation on these things. That might be a topic that comes up. I do want to talk a little bit about post hoc, ergo propter hoc, correlation versus causation, etc., as part of a whole host of things that have popped into my mind of various topics that I think would be useful. This would be a short form video series as opposed to what we usually do here. Something like 5 to 7 minute commentaries on things that don't easily dovetail into legality, video games, pop culture, or headlines. But I appreciate the tip. I think that's a good notion of talking about things like that as part of a conversation about when biases form and how we should interpret things. Eddie also offers the possibility we just don't talk politics. Problem solved. Yeah, I mean, there used to be a series of things that you just didn't talk about: the family dinner table or the business lunch, whatever it might be, right? And they were politics, they were sex, they were religion. These types of topics are just naturally kind of a part of people's core identities, and you're not going to convince anybody over drinks over a major topic of importance. So you shouldn't bring it up because it just makes everybody uncomfortable. We've left that behind a little bit. I think we've lost something there because I do think people kind of enjoy gnashing at each other a little bit more than they used to back in the day. But I think we don't talk about politics is an option. Certainly. It's a little bit harder when you're at like a family function where you're there for a number of days. But yes, I get that, Eddie. 100%. All right. With that said, let's talk about the main event. Let's see if we can get this all set up and hit the right buttons and everything. We can do it. Almost the right buttons. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. I really appreciate it. I do want to remind folks, as I just said, to thank Brentwood Chic for the memberships offered to the Hoeg Law channel. We can't do it without support from viewers and listeners like you. If you're catching this in replay, please do vote for it on the podcast that you're listening to it on, or leave a comment if you're on YouTube. Leave upvotes, downvotes, do all those happy things. And I will try to remember to grab the memberships and super chat messages after we're done discussing the headlines that we're going to discuss today. Now, if you aren't familiar with this topic, I do want to point out that the Joe Rogan Experience is a very popular podcast in which a number of different people meet with Joe and discuss various topics of national or other interests. And a few people watch this. You might see here, it's probably a little too small for you to see right now, but the Joe Rogan Experience Donald Trump from just 6 days ago has 42 million views. Now, I truly believe if we get our minds together, our reasonable minds, and we upvote this video and we tell folks that we're having a conversation like this one in Hangouts and Headlines, we can get to like 1/1000th of that number, I believe. So let people know. Just 1/1000th, 42 million views, we can do it. But suffice it to say, it's a very popular video. You can see here he interviewed Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the Republican nominees for president and vice president, respectively. And we don't have a similar entry for Kamala Harris, or Tim Walz. Now, part of that is because I searched for Trump Rogan Experience, but the other part of that is because those interviews weren't done. And as part of this, a number of folks were out there essentially saying that Joe Rogan was trying to push Donald Trump and JD Vance, that he was pushing for a Republican vote in this presidential election. And Joe came out with a tweet the other day that said the following. Also, for the record, the Harris campaign has not passed on doing the podcast. They offered a date for Tuesday, but I would have had to travel to her, and they only wanted to do an hour. His videos are usually about 3 hours. I strongly feel the best way to do it is in the studio in Austin. My sincere wish is to just have a nice conversation and get to know her as a human being. I really hope we can make it happen. Now, I saw this before any of the furor around various news outlets discussing this came into being. And I got to tell you, when I first saw this, I effectively read this as an apologetic for Kamala Harris, right? The reporting was going out there saying Joe is pushing for Trump, but it was also saying that Harris is essentially avoiding Joe, right? And this is the most popular podcast on earth. And so you wouldn't ordinarily think that a campaign would avoid Joe Rogan or any other podcast that was as popular as his. And so I read this as essentially a response to that, saying, no, Harris hasn't skipped on doing the podcast. It's just they offer different terms. And I strongly believe the best way to do it is in a studio in Austin. Now, people that don't like Joe could say that he's a wimp for this, or that he is just rejecting her terms. We'll see that various headlines do that as part of this conversation. I do think that there is a bit of a disconnect between what a podcast is, what a podcaster is, and what the media thinks they are. And I saw this not just in issues of importance, like with respect to interviewing the vice president or nominee for president of the United States, but also in the smaller spheres that I operate in, right? Which is that there are people that seem to think that folks have some kind of right, whether it's political or otherwise, to appear on another person's podcast or show format or what have you. And it's my honest opinion, having worked in this particular, let's call it an industry, I guess, it never feels that way, for now more than 5 years, that this is a place where we really get to decide what it is that we're going to talk about, right? And people aren't afforded the right to appear on our show, and they certainly aren't afforded the right by their own nature to determine how we are going to operate our show. Now, obviously, I'm speaking entirely on my own here. This is outside of the purview of talking with the vice president of the United States, a nominee for president. But I can at least relate to the notion that if I'm going to have my show be my show, then I get to determine how that show is going to be run. And you can say, well, Joe is only trying to seek his own comfort level in his own studio in Austin, Texas, or he's only trying to keep Kamala off his airwaves, and this is an excuse for him to do so. You can make these claims, but I want to say from my perspective that I can certainly understand wanting to be comfortable, and especially, and I haven't seen this kind of discussed as a point of these various articles, especially when you are talking to someone in such a position of power, right? It is very easy in this kind of industry, again, to be in a position where you are harmed by something that you say or look at or otherwise reveal in a live podcast or a lightly edited podcast format. And so it's very easy before the show starts to feel tense or concerned about what you might accidentally say, what you might do, or otherwise, because it's going to go out online, and online is forever. And you can ruin livelihoods, your own and others, by something that you say on a podcast like this one. So I can also understand that, hey, I like to do it in my room. I like to have a certain way I go about getting prepped for my videos. And I want it to be that way, especially when an interview would be of the level of importance of someone like Kamala Harris. And so I am inclined by the way that this text is written, and from the understanding that I have of what it means to run a podcast, certainly not anywhere near Joe Rogan's level, but please don't try to assume that I'm equating myself with Joe Rogan. I know I'm not anywhere near there, but I can understand the feelings that go into this, that I would want to have essentially control over my own procedure if I knew an interview was of the level of importance of someone like Kamala Harris. And so I look at this from a kind of empathetic, sympathetic standpoint and say, he's trying to defend the Harris campaign here at the top. and saying, I really want to do it in Austin. That's the way I've always done it. And I don't want to be in a position where something is alien or unusual to me on an issue of this level of importance for both my own career and for hers. Because a live broadcast is just a very difficult thing to get through without something happening online, and especially in politics where things can be misconstrued, and not just misconstrued, but deliberately kind of malconstrued for the benefit of one side or the other. I don't want to be a part of that process. So again, not a specific Joe Rogan fan. Don't listen to his podcast myself, but I read this from a pretty sympathetic mindscape, and I think that it is a good message overall to put out there. Others disagree. So here's the New Republic. New Republic says Joe Rogan offers pitiful defense for why he won't interview Harris. I've highlighted various words of this headline and subheadline because I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, pitiful defense, very strong kind of emotional language there. I don't know that I would characterize what Joe is saying here as a defense of himself. It is a little bit towards the end here, but it really does strike me as a defense of Harris for the most part at the top. And certainly he finishes by saying he wanted to have a nice conversation. It sounds like a very kind of apolitical stance that he has here. And you can believe he's lying. You can believe that he's hiding the ball, and he really does just want Vance and Trump to win their respective offices. But I think at least in the words that we can read on our screen right now, it is not suggestive of that fact. The other portion of this headline I wanted to highlight is why he won't interview Harris. Now, there's nothing incorrect about that. He's talking about why an interview is unlikely to happen, but the he won't interview Harris is a very kind of active take on what is happening here. I teach grammar to my daughter, and one of the things that we do is we analyze sentences and we diagram them. I don't know if you remember in the chat diagramming sentences, if you had to do that when you were in grammar school, but one of the things that you do when you do that is you analyze what the subject is, what the active verb is, and you get a notion of what the sentence is actually doing. So here, the major part of this particular portion of the sentence is he won't interview Harris. And that is a very kind of active notion. It sounds like he is deliberately trying to avoid interviewing Harris, which he may be doing, but it's certainly implying, editorializing what is happening here from just the message that we have. And I like this story, much like I like the stories that we started Hangouts and Headlines with vis-a-vis Depp v. Heard, because we can see everything that this article is reporting on. This isn't anonymous sources. This is just going to be based on that tweet that we just read, and we can kind of assert for ourselves whether or not this is a fair description of events as described to us by the New Republic. Now, I also think it's important to note that the New Republic does not try to hide its biases for the most part. The New Republic, as described here in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I didn't know was still a thing, but apparently is still a website, is described as reflecting the progressive movement and sought reforms in American government and society. They were a part of supporting the formation of labor unions, the 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy until the Treaty of Versailles, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, etc. They are very much on the left side of perspective, and they are an opinion kind of magazine. They're allowed to have these things. In fact, I like that these kinds of things exist because they do give you the perspectives that you need from various other folks on these topics. But this is presented at least as a kind of news headline, and I think it probably goes a little bit too far, especially when we get to the subheadline, which says Joe Rogan attempted to explain why he snubbed Kamala Harris in favor of Donald Trump. Joe Rogan says he's still open to interviewing Kamala Harris if she'll drop everything and come to him. Responding to rumors on both sides of the aisle, the podcast host took to X, Twitter to you and I, in the wee hours of Tuesday morning to clear up some confusion about why his proposed interview with the vice president hasn't materialized. Too long didn't read? He'll only speak with Harris on his terms. Now, strictly speaking, that sounds like it is correct. But again, you can imagine a Trump version of this headline that says something like, Weak Harris refuses to talk with Joe Rogan and Number One podcast on terms that Donald Trump had already agreed to, right? You can understand that you can have this set of facts that we know, and you can deliver a biased headline in various ways and in various different directions. I don't think that's super useful for understanding what's happening here, and that's one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you all today. With only a week left until Election Day and a packed schedule of rallies, interviews, and campaign events, it seems that Harris may not have Rogan's audience of mostly Republican and independent young men top of mind. But this lukewarm defense from Rogan makes it clear that he wants to put all the blame on Harris, when really it's also his stubbornness at fault. I think that certainly Joe Rogan is a part of it, of not coming to an agreement as to how a podcast interview might go. He's got the podcast. She's got the interview subject as part of her campaign. And so it takes two to, as it were, not tango on this particular score. But you can frame that as a Rogan problem. You can frame that as a Harris problem. You can frame that in various different ways. And certainly the New Republic is electing a very certain way to frame this. And it's a way that doesn't make all the sense in the world to me. Certainly, to the extent that Rogan's audience is mostly Republican and independent young men, that sounds like exactly the kind of audience that a not Republican, not independent young man would want to reach. It's not obvious exactly how the Harris campaign intends to reach a similar audience. Maybe you think it's just lost. Maybe you think Rogan's audience is just not available to you. Maybe you think that Rogan is going to have gotcha questions or put you in a bad light. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip here. But for whatever reason, it's not obvious to me that you wouldn't want to meet that audience, right? So it might not be top of mind. That probably wouldn't be wise. It seems like you can double your efforts if you can hit an audience that wouldn't otherwise see you and convince them to vote for you instead of your opponent. But hey, I'm just a guy. I'm not a campaign manager. Perhaps Donald Trump set up an impossible standard with his interview for the Joe Rogan Experience, as the Republican nominee backed out of several previously scheduled events to travel to the Austin podcast studio. During his 3-hour interview with Trump, Rogan allowed the former president to lie to his millions of viewers about immigration, the economy, and the 2020 election. And I'm not going to talk about what Trump says there, just in case the YouTube overlords get mad. With Harris's tentative cancellation, Rogan's schedule is wide open. Excuse me. And so the podcaster will now instead interview Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance on Wednesday morning, rather than make any sacrifices to interview the sitting vice president and Democratic nominee for president. Vance will travel to Austin to appear on the show. Now, this might be a better gotcha if you had Joe Rogan deciding to give J.D. Vance some of the things that the Harris campaign would appear to have asked for, vis-a-vis travel or shortening of the interview. But the fact that J.D. Vance agreed to travel to Austin to appear on the show, which is exactly what Joe Rogan suggests he asked for the Harris campaign to do, does not appear to be the gotcha that the New Republic wants you to believe it is here at the end. But the New Republic isn't strictly an unbiased news source. So we can look at other headlines and try to decide for ourselves whether or not this is a fair understanding of the situation. Let's look at the Politico article here. This is closer to the truth, in my opinion. Rogan says he rejected Harris campaign's interview conditions. The Harris campaign has not passed on doing the podcast, Rogan said in a post on X. Podcast host Joe Rogan declined the Harris campaign's offer to record an interview with Kamala Harris on Tuesday because he would have had to travel to her, and they only wanted to do an hour. But the interview isn't off the table. The Joe Rogan Experience is the largest podcast in the U.S. with an audience that is largely young and male, a demographic where former President Donald Trump leads Harris. The Harris campaign has worked to gain support with male voters in recent weeks. An interview with Rogan would offer Harris the opportunity to make her case to his large audience. Rogan, a comedian turned podcaster and UFC commentator, has hosted a range of guests with diverse ideologies on his show. From conspiracy theorist Alex Jones to comedians like Chris Rock and political figures like Trump and Bernie Sanders. Trump's sit down in Austin on Friday with Rogan, which had more than 37 million views on YouTube, lasted the usual 3 hours. In the wide-ranging interview, he said a politician needs the attitude of a comedian. He also called hosts of The View so stupid. In his interview with Rogan, Trump said that he hoped Harris would agree to sit down with Rogan because it would be a mess. Rogan responded that they would have a fine conversation. And yeah, you can see here, Trump, obviously the adversary of Harris in this election, says things like he hopes that she would sit down with Rogan because he thinks it would be a terrible interview, that she would be a mess. Rogan responds in what seems to be, again, characteristic of his tweet here, in a kind of affable situation, saying, hey, I think it would be a good conversation. I want to get to know her as a human being. And you don't have to agree with Joe Rogan. You can think he's hiding the ball here. But the reporting is suggestive of the fact that he is hiding the ball here, right? Like they describe him as a comedian, podcaster, and UFC commentator. They describe his guests with diverse ideologies as Alex Jones, Chris Rock, and Trump before they get to Bernie Sanders. And the descriptions here While true, Rogan says he rejected Harris campaign's interview conditions, could just as easily be written as Harris campaign rejects Rogan's conditions. And it again assumes a certain kind of power dynamic that I don't think is actually justified in 2024, right? We've got a guy with the most popular podcast in the world. We've got a person running for one of the most powerful offices in the world. And there's a natural kind of immovable object, unstoppable force component here, which is to say, if they don't agree, excuse me, which is to say, if they don't agree, I am really sorry, folks that have come out to have this conversation with me today. I am doing my best. I'm hopeful that my voice will hold out. It's not looking great right this second, but please do give me just a second. Which is to say, it kind of comes down to who needs the other more, right? In general, if a presidential candidate was to say, hey, Rick, can I come on Virtual Legality or Hangouts and Headlines and have a talk with you? I would be inclined to say yes, because that's super useful to me and my channel. I can get more views than I otherwise would. I can have a good conversation, maybe get better information out there. I can get the questions I want answered from these people of massive importance to the United States political scene. But if I'm Joe Rogan, I don't have most of those advantages. I don't want to leave my studio for whatever reason. You can ascribe good or bad motivations to him for that. I don't want to leave my studio. I don't want to make these extra concessions. I don't need you, says Joe Rogan in his head, one assumes. You need me to reach this various audience that you can't otherwise reach, despite what the New Republic says. And so I'm the one in power, not you. And that's throwing various pieces of the media for a loop when we discuss these things. And so I did want to mention that, even though I think the Politico headline is closer to reality, that others are having conversations like the one we're having here on this particular topic. Here's Mark Hemingway, who I believe was a conservative reporter at one point in time, but it was reposted by the Joe Rogan podcast, says, as far as I know, Joe Rogan has done every interview he's ever done under the exact same conditions. It's far more accurate to say Harris rejected Rogan. And again, everybody is motivated on these things, right? Everybody that you're looking at is motivated by making Harris look good, making Harris look bad, and making Rogan look good, or Trump look good, making Rogan or Trump look bad, etc. And so you have to look at all these things from these various perspectives, and it's not easy to do. I'm not sitting here to tell you that this is an easy conversation to have, but I am sitting here telling you that it's a conversation that you have to have with yourself going into any election season, but in particular a presidential election season in the United States, provided you're in the United States, because so many folks have so many opinions on these various things. And the good ones, I'm going to put the New Republic in this bucket actually, will go out there and explain to you where their perspectives are coming from so that you can better triangulate what it is that they would otherwise be tilted towards or against. But the bad ones, the news media that is out there that is pretending to be entirely objective and maybe isn't so much doing that, are really making things difficult for reasonable minds to go out there and try to find this information. And that's why I wanted to end this particular conversation piece with the discussion of the Washington Post. Now, you've heard me discuss the Washington Post in Hangouts and Headlines quite a lot. You've heard me discuss them in the context of attack articles on colleagues of mine on YouTube, and in various contexts with the way that they reported on aspects of Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard. But in this particular context, the Washington Post, as well as the Los Angeles Times and some other major outlets in the United States, elected to this particular election not endorse a candidate for president. And these were outlets that were assumed to wind up endorsing Kamala Harris, elected not to do so. You can ascribe any motivations you want on this. One of the things that I said as part of the Apple versus Epic series of videos we did in Virtual Legality is that I thought that Tim Sweeney and Epic Games in particular were very bad messengers of the lawsuit that they were trying to bring against Apple, that there were people in better positions to do that didn't have the baggage that they did. I'm going to tell you right now that this editorial from Jeff Bezos is complicated by the fact that it's Jeff Bezos. That a reasonable mind can look at this and say Jeff Bezos is motivated by his business interests, by his connections with Donald Trump, by any other number of things to prevent his newspaper from endorsing someone like Kamala Harris. And I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. But Jeff Bezos is going to tell you that that isn't in fact the case. And I think he makes a number of interesting points in this particular editorial when he was explaining why it is that the Washington Post didn't endorse anyone for president this year. So he says, the hard truth, Americans don't trust the news media. And certainly Hangouts and Headlines is one of those places where I think we can see that kind of put forth in the world. I will sit here and tell you that I like the media. I like the concept of journalism. I think it's important to have people going out there and finding these things out, because otherwise I can't comment on them. I don't have my boots on the ground in these various places. And I think that it's an important function. I'll also tell you that I think that that function has been distorted, corrupted, and in various other ways made less useful than it has in even the recent past. And Jeff Bezos agrees. In the annual public surveys about trust and reputation, journalists in the media have regularly fallen near the very bottom, often just above Congress. But in this year's Gallup poll, we have managed to fall below Congress. Our profession is now the least trusted of all. Less trusted than lawyers, folks. Think of that. Something we are doing is clearly not working. Let me give an analogy. Voting machines must meet two requirements. So as an editorial, this is all allowed. But as a rhetorical piece of advice, I might suggest not going immediately into an area of significant consternation for folks in a political season to make your neutral analogy. But here we are, going to do it anyway. Voting machines must meet two requirements. They must count the vote accurately, and people must believe they count the vote accurately. The second requirement is distinct from and just as important as the first. And Jeff Bezos is correct on this. This is where you might hear me say that the appearance of impropriety is just as bad as impropriety itself, that if your system needs faith of the people that use it to function like the judicial system does, like the voting system does, then a loss of faith is just as bad as a loss of effectiveness. It's one of the issues that I think people don't really understand about the discussions regarding how people vote, early mail-in ballots, voter ID, various other things that happen online and elsewhere, that the appearance of insecurity in our election or voting system is really just as bad as that insecurity. And you can say that there are bad actors that help foment that feeling of insecurity, and that is, in fact, bad action. But to the extent that it is effective, every effort should be taken to make sure that that insecurity goes away. And unfortunately, I don't think that is, in fact, what's happening here. And I blame politicians on both sides for that. But I would certainly seek to have the feelings of security afforded to our election system that are not presently there for reasons that you can ascribe to a number of different folks making a number of different statements over the past 4 years or more. Likewise, with newspapers, we must be accurate and we must be believed to be accurate. And this is important. It's very true, right? One of the things we talk about in Hangouts and Headlines, what I just mentioned is that I don't have boots on the ground, is that nobody can really have factual, personal awareness of everything that's happening in the world, or certainly everything that's happening that's important to the way that they live their lives. And so you do depend on going through some kind of filter, somebody else's work to get that information. And you must believe them to be delivering that information in something approaching a fully truthful manner. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but we are failing on the second requirement. Most people believe the media is biased, and I think justifiably so. Anyone who doesn't see this is paying scant attention to reality, and those who fight reality lose. Reality is an undefeated champion. It would be easy to blame others for our long and continuing fall in credibility, but a victim mentality will not help. Complaining is not a strategy. We must work hard to control what we can control to increase our credibility. It's interesting here that he finishes this paragraph with this kind of notion of we must increase our control. I don't know that that necessarily follows from what he's saying here. I don't know that an increase in control, a tightening of the reins, if you will, is what actually will cause people to better believe you in the long run. But he certainly thinks that, and we'll see some slipping here as we move on towards attacks on things like, YouTube videos about the media and podcasts about political parties and whatnot being a problem for the Washington Post. I wish we had made the change away from endorsements earlier than we did in a moment further from the election and the emotions around it. That was inadequate planning and not some intentional strategy, says Jeff Bezos. And you don't have to believe him on this. When it comes to the appearance of conflict, I am not an ideal owner of the Post. Every day, somewhere, some Amazon executive or Blue Origin executive or someone from the other philanthropies and companies I own or invest in is meeting with government officials. Now, this is a number of useful things that he says here. One, and I want to talk about this rhetorically, it is useful to acknowledge your weaknesses. And I know people kind of go away from this, but it is useful both in a legal brief and in an opinion in the Washington Post to acknowledge those areas where a reasonable mind might be able to critique what you are saying. Here, Jeff Bezos acknowledges that. He says, look, I'm a rich guy. I have people that are talking to government officials all the time. So the fact that I had someone talking to a Donald Trump official on the morning of our announcement is not ideal. But he says, look, I'm credible on this. You don't have to believe him, right? But it's more useful to acknowledge this than to just let it stay between the lines. And I do think that that's a good effort in an opinion editorial like this one. You can see my wealth and business interests as a bulwark against intimidation, or you can see them as a web of conflicting interests. Truthfully told, they're both. Only my own principles can tip the balance from one to the other, which is a long way of saying, trust me. I assure you that my views here are in fact principled, and I believe my track record as owner of the Post since 2013 backs this up. You are, of course, free to make your own determination. I'm glad he did not assert otherwise. But I challenge you to find one instance in those 11 years where I have prevailed upon anyone at the Post in favor of my own interests. Well, that's going to be difficult for me to do. You need a reporter to do that, discussing with folks who worked at the Post since 2013, whether or not you've ever done it before. But certainly I think your mere existence and kind of light-handed recommendations of direction can affect things more than you might be admitting in this particular paragraph. Lack of credibility isn't unique to the Post. Our brethren newspapers have the same issue. Many people are turning to off-the-cuff podcasts, inaccurate social media posts, and other unverified news sources, which can quickly spread misinformation and deepen divisions. And this is where I think, again, the mask slips a little bit. We see this from the Washington Post a lot. It's one of the reasons they come up in Hangouts and Headlines so often. And that is that there is this kind of underlying bias that isn't really political in nature, but is, hey, we run a legacy media outlet. We run an old masthead media piece. Other people are finding their information from folks like Hoeg, that idiot, who's doing Hangouts and Headlines instead of from Taylor Lorenz or whoever else we have reporting on Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and off-the-cuff podcasts, as if it's easy to just throw out a podcast into the world. Inaccurate social media posts. They couldn't possibly be accurate, and other unverified news sources. And I don't know exactly what work Unverified is doing here, but presumably this is a statement that the journalistic ethics that control an editorial room at the Washington Post is better and more well-equipped to deliver truth content to you than somebody who's sitting in their office with a microphone and just saying whatever they like to you. And I will say this, YouTube, podcasts, social media in general does not have a lot of the old school institutional protections that legacy masthead media does. But just because they don't have those protections doesn't mean that you can throw all of them into the inaccurate and unverified bucket because you don't like them and because you are spending a lot of money on overhead and reporters that may or may not be doing what it is that you want them to do for your particular outlet. And I don't think he's meaning to get into this topic too in-depthfully here, but it does slip out. It does slip out a little bit later on as well. And it's clear that he owns the Washington Post. He doesn't want people to get their news from places that aren't, at bare minimum, legacy media, of which the Washington Post is one. While I do not and will not push my personal interest, I will also not allow this paper to stay on autopilot and fade into irrelevance, overtaken by unresearched podcasts and social media barbs, not without a fight. It's too important. The stakes are too high. Now more than ever, the world needs a credible, trusted, independent voice, and where better for that voice to originate than the capital city of the most important country in the world? I don't know. My offer would be somewhere in the Midwest that doesn't have direct connections to things like the federal government. But again, I might just be talking out of hand. I am, of course, an unverified, unruly podcast type person. So, hey, to win this fight, we will have to exercise new muscles. Some changes will be a return to the past, and some will be new inventions. Criticism will be part and parcel of anything new, of course. This is the way of the world. None of this will be easy, but it will be worth it. I am so grateful to be a part of this endeavor. Many of the finest journalists you'll find anywhere work at the Washington Post, and they work painstakingly every day to get to the truth. They deserve to be believed. And here I do want to offer the disclaimer. I do work regularly with Gene Park, who is the main video game and other pop culture reporter for the Washington Post and also a contributor to Last Stand Media, where you can find me discussing such important truths as the nature of Kintsugi and how it is reflected in the Game of the Year kind of contest here coming up at the end of 2024. But I do want to say I have that connection. I think this is a relatively good editorial. I think the slippage here about what it is that we do here in Hangouts and Headlines or elsewhere on YouTube is unwarranted, but I do think there are bad actors in this space. Certainly, I don't want to suggest that there aren't, but it is a part of this conversation, right? When you have the New Republic going out there and saying that it is a pitiful defense that Joe Rogan offers when he says something like, for the record, the Harris campaign is not passed on doing the podcast, then I think we do have to discuss where it is that people get their news, how media is reporting on these things, and why the trust in media is so very low. And unfortunately for the Washington Post, they can't control outlets like the New Republic. They can't control outlets like Politico. So to the extent that in an election season, you're getting headlines that are at bare minimum kind of obviously slanted when we can see all of the news in front of us, we have to read the other headlines that they put forth when we can't see all that foundational information as likely slanted as well. That's where I come out on this. And I hope this was informational and useful as a conversation piece for all of you here in Hangouts and Headlines. Let me know what you think as we move to last Hangouts of this particular video. Thank you for bearing with me as my voice gave out there in the middle. Gabriel Morato says, for the record, I actually canceled my longtime Washington Post subscription because of the Taylor Lorenz LawTube episode. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? And I don't think Taylor Lorenz actually works at the Washington Post anymore. I think she quit. But that is totally fair, Gabriel. Thank you so much. I thought that was really bad, and I was surprised at just how bad it wound up being. So, let's see here. I'll remove the headlines ticker here. Got too many buttons. I need to put these all in order. I need macros. Kelly C says she quote unquote quit. Yes, there is a lot of that out there, right? You quit. You are told that you better resign, or else we're going to resign for you, as it were. I don't know the specifics of that particular circumstance, but she does no longer work for the Washington Post. Chris says, Hoeg, sadly, some people want entertainment with their politics, which is why Trump seems so popular. I do think that he has a certain kind of comic timing that he puts into his interviews that maybe most normal or non-entertainment related politicians can't do in quite the same way, and that folks are looking to be entertained as part of this. And I leave that to your judgment as to whether or not that's acceptable for deciding your political leaders. But because I have this screen up, I do want to remind myself to go and make sure that I have hit things like Nick Starro offering 50 krona for the Rick Hoeg ball cap fund. I actually have a ball cap right here, but especially when I'm sick, sometimes I just don't want to squeeze my head that way. And part of the reason that you've seen me without a hat on so often these last couple of years is that I do get a little bit concerned about squeezing on where my head scar is. Not for any reason, not because anything's going to pop or anything, but just because it does add a pressure to my head that wasn't there before. I don't like to be reminded of those kinds of things. So there you go. Thank you for the donation to the ball cap fund. I will keep it in mind. We'll get a new ball cap before you know it. Sugar Magnet 78, thank you for being a member for 2 years. Limited time left, and campaigns need to decide how to use that time best. Certainly. That is a justifiable reason for Kamala Harris to say, I'm not going to spend 3 hours with you in your Austin studio. There are justifications here on both sides. These are two powerful people with two powerful assets. And I think a reasonable mind can look at this and say, that's too long. I don't want to accede to it. I don't think it will reflect well for me. I don't think I will make inroads in my campaign the way that others might think I could. And that's a reason for me to not do X, Y, or Z. Law and Lumber, Rob's here, gifting 20 Hoeg Law memberships. Rob, you are the best. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I am so sorry that I have not been awake, really, to join any of your Friday night streams or Ian's Monday night streams, because I'm going to bed a lot earlier now. But I really appreciate the constant invites, and I thank you so much for helping support the channel. I really, really do. And I think that's everything that I missed while I was talking / coughing my way through a discussion of the headlines. So with that now said, let's ask you the important questions here. So do you side with Joe? Do you side with Kamala? Did he offer considered restrictions? He wants it to be in Austin. He wants it to be for 3 hours. Is Kamala right on any of the restrictions she offered, namely the 1 hour time limit or the travel? Do you disbelieve any of this story? Is Joe not telling it accurately when he puts it in Twitter? What are your thoughts on this as presented by Joe Rogan and the various things that we were able to see in the media as of right now. Joshua Ford says it hurts seeing people trust social media more than they should just because the legacy media has lost trust. Feels lost on many people why both types can be and are still untrustworthy. Certainly human beings have their own biases, have their own reasons for putting information out there and in the way that they do it. And that doesn't go away with social media. And in fact, the chances that that person is more biased than they're letting on probably increases in social media. So I do think people need to be cautious wherever they get their information. But it is not the case, as Jeff Bezos kind of suggests, that just because the information is coming from a podcast or just because the information is coming from Hangouts and Headlines, Virtual Legality, or otherwise, that it is less trustworthy than something coming from a bylined author at the Washington Post. You can kind of put it in probabilities. And there are certainly people that are less inclined for truth value and useful information than I am here on YouTube. But reasonable people, and I believe that most people are reasonable, can judge these things for themselves, certainly. Law and Lumber asks, when the entire business model is delivery of factual recitation of newsworthy events, with the subsection being an editorial section, why are any news outlets endorsing anyone in any case? And I think this was something that changed pretty recently in the American political landscape, like 60s or 70s recently. I tend to agree that if you are out there projecting yourself as an unbiased news source, that probably you shouldn't be putting forth endorsements in any political race. But kind of dropping the endorsement like a week before they would have been otherwise issued does ring at least of a certain amount of falsity. And I understand people that say this is some kind of game that these outlets, the LA Times and the Washington Post, are playing because of Donald Trump, because of Kamala Harris, whatever it is that you want to ascribe it to. And so I do think that Jeff Bezos, again, acknowledging his weakness in that editorial we just read, saying this was not a great time to do this, I admit, is useful. It is a weak point in this particular conversation. Yes, there was no indication they weren't going to endorse anybody, and they had in the prior elections for a long, long time until a week before that endorsement would have been issued. Not a great look. But I tend to agree that endorsements from newspapers, not super useful. Part of the Jeff Bezos editorial that I don't think we wound up reading on this video is that nobody's going to change their mind based on a newspaper endorsement. So why do we even do this? We're burning whatever kind of trust capital we have in a fire for no discernible reason. And that's something that gets on the nerves of something like a tech owner, right? Why are we doing this thing? It can't just be because we've done it in the past. Why are we doing this now? It seems to have a cost with no gain. Let's not do it this way. Makes a lot of sense to me, but it doesn't make a ton of sense to potentially his subscribers or his newsroom. And so that's one of the reasons we're seeing this being discussed in opinion editorials in other outlets throughout this past week. But what do you think of the restrictions, folks? What do you think of what Kamala Harris apparently asked for, what Joe Rogan was enforcing? Richard here says the time limitation is reasonable. I don't want it to be 3 hours, 1 hour. Asking him to come to her, not so much. I tend to think that that's probably a good split. It's a good compromise position. I would want Kamala Harris to agree to an interview structure that isn't as edited as some of the things that we have seen online, because I do think there's a usefulness to seeing these people in the room, right? One thing that comes across with the Donald Trump and JD Vance interviews is that they are different as people in the room than they are on the stump, than they are in their political speeches. And that I think is useful for folks to know. It's not something that we've gotten to know about our politicians very often in the past. And I think that's the usefulness of that particular kind of format. And I think it's why it's useful to a lot of people in 2024. So maybe not 3 hours, maybe an hour and a half, maybe even the hour that she offered. But yeah, I do think that Joe Rogan, as the podcaster, is justified in saying, for something of this importance, I can't upend my usual way of doing things. And you might say, well, he's a professional. He's got however many millions of viewers or subscribers. And he is. But he is, as the Politico article reminds us, a comedian and UFC commentator before he was a podcaster, right? This is not a job that you get into going through a fully vetted 11 interview process. You essentially get used to talking online in video form, either to others or, as the case in Hangouts and Headlines, primarily to myself and to chat here, And it is one where any amount of discomfort could really throw off your game. And in the context of an interview with a leading nominee for president, when you've already given an interview in a more comfortable setting to the other nominee for president, does have the potential, if I'm sitting there as Joe Rogan, for looking odd in some way that could be harmful or helpful to the Harris campaign in a way that I don't want my particular platform to be used. So I tend to agree with this kind of take. The 1 hour, okay, where at the last week of the election, hours are at a premium. There's only so much time to go around, but making him travel, maybe not. A Hettinger says it's his show, his format. Imagine if Trump tried to dictate the terms for a 60-minute interview. I think certainly if the text message, if the tweet had gone out there and said that Trump was still invited, but this is what he had asked for, then you might see a very different bent, certainly from places like the New Republic, on whether or not Rogan was fleeing the interview or whether Trump was. And that's part of the conversation that we're having here, is that these various outlets, various places that you might get your news information, have a tendency to skew things in one direction or the other. And I don't really blame a place like the New Republic that's clearly, in their history and the way that they report on things, a kind of progressive left-leaning outlet. But I do think we need to take it into account that these things are going out there when we have all the information in front of us. And I don't think that Joe Rogan was trying to look like the bad actor here in this particular tweet, but it does make folks less inclined to tweet out the real information if they know they're going to get reported on like the New Republic did. So I think that's part of the conversation as well. Now, let's continue on. Mama Bet says, can I believe both and not like how it was reported? Absolutely. I don't think there's any reason to not believe that Joe Rogan is describing what the Harris campaign asked for and what he asked for accurately. At least nobody has presented any information to me as to why that we shouldn't believe that it's accurately mentioned in that respect. But you can dislike how the New Republic and Politico have framed the particular issue. In fact, that's what this conversation is all about, Mama Vets. So absolutely. Robert Jones says, Joe doesn't want to break his format, and Harris is probably under time crunch this late in the campaign. Perfectly reasonable. I think that is an entirely legitimate take on this state of affairs, is that Harris doesn't have the time, doesn't have the inclination, doesn't think it would be too useful to her to reach that particular audience. And it's a big deal to go fly to Texas and be in an interview room for 3 hours knowing that your campaign is on the line. And Joe is only inclined to do it the way he's always done it. I think that is a totally reasonable take on these things. Midnight Wind offers the kind of alternative take, which is Kamala would have blew it. She ran, which was smart and very bad at the same time. She just doesn't do live well at all. That had to dodge it. And again, this is a kind of political take on this. I can't pretend to know how Kamala Harris would have done in that setting. I think that Joe Rogan at least presents to me from afar, as not a regular viewer of his content, as someone that is primarily kind of a curious, as someone else described it, caveman trying to learn things, interviewer in this context. And I think that probably is a format that can work for someone that even maybe doesn't do the kind of 60-minute circuit as well, 60-minute circuit as well as others. But reasonable minds can differ on even that. We both can't predict the future, and certainly we can't predict another dimension of the future that didn't happen. So I do think that the anti-Kamala side has a tendency to look at it this way. I can't blame them for looking at it that way. But I just don't think that we know one way or the other. RJ says, I don't think it's reasonable for Rogan to put a demand for her to have to go to Texas. She is running for president. She is busy and needs to be in more places. Well, I mean, I think it's a condition, right? If you want to be on this show, you have to come to me and do it the way I've always done it. Demand sounds too strong to me. It is, in fact, a condition for saying this is, if you want to be on this podcast, this is what you would need to do. And maybe Harris doesn't care about being on that podcast. The problem for folks, I think, for the most part, is that Joe Rogan has such a successful podcast that Trump getting whatever 42 million views in 6 days and Vance getting another 7 million views in 18 hours is a problem at a campaign level. But it's not Joe Rogan's problem. It is, if anybody's problem, Kamala Harris's. Rob continues his endorsement discussion by saying it's an inherently opinionated act. It indeed is. It is overtly expressing how the endorser believes you should interpret and perceive the facts that they present. yes, I tend to agree. It is the notion that we are interviewing people. We are the investigative reporters. We have seen these folks in person, and we have adjudged for ourselves exactly who is the most trustworthy and better fit to sit in whatever office we are endorsing it for. And yes, it does imply that the way they are reporting on the truth value is that they are slanted in the direction of whatever they are endorsing, whether that's a party or a person. It really depends on what the endorsement is that we're talking about. I tend to agree that that lowers, in my estimation, how I can feel about what are supposed to be objective, factual things that you are reporting on. And that is a risk for somebody like the Washington Post. That is the argument Jeff Bezos puts forth for not endorsing people. I kind of skipped it as part of our conversation, but that's the argument he puts forth. I tend to agree with you, Rob. Ariel Myers says, I don't care about Joe or anyone who goes on his channel, although I do think he tries to be accurate, and I don't blame Harris for not doing it. I'm going off long-form history, and I don't trust any of them. Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate but totally understandable position to be in. I don't trust anybody who's saying anything on any of this. I don't trust any politicians. I don't trust any of these institutions, and that's fair. I'm not going to sit here and tell you should trust any of the things here. I think Jeff Bezos is correct in saying there's a reason journalism has lost its trustworthiness in 2024. But it is a shame, right? We can admit that it's a shame that we are in a situation now in 2024 where we both can't have those boots on the ground, can't have the personal information of talking with these people in a room that we need to, and we can't trust those that do. That puts us in an untenable, kind of unlivable situation over the long term because we're otherwise acting in a vacuum on any of these topics. So yeah, I agree. I agree that you can come to that kind of level. I view it as cynical, but I don't view it as unwarranted. And that's a shame for living in a body politic like we are today. Against the Tide says, Rob, that's why I'm not a fan of any celebrity that pushes for any candidate, whatever side they do it for. I do think that there used to be a point in time, you can remember when Michael Jordan used to say, hey, Republicans buy sneakers too, that celebrities would avoid these kinds of endorsements or real activist messaging because of that, because you are less inclined to listen to them on other topics. I think it's a kind of different issue than news generation because ideally you're not looking to a celebrity to deliver actual factual information on any of these topics. You're looking to them to entertain you by pretending to be the Incredible Hulk or what have you. And so I think it's a little bit different in that vein, but it is an issue that I have with celebrity endorsements as well. I tend to put to the side whatever person that's creating the media that I enjoy's politics are. It's one of the issues that I have when those politics are put so much at the forefront of what should ostensibly be entertainment media. But I agree that we live in a different world now in 2024 with celebrities and whatnot than we did before. Gabriel says, I think when it comes to the endorsement discussion, what happened to the Hollywood Teamster Union is a much more interesting case to look into. I will look into it, Gabriel. I don't actually know that one. So I will keep that on my list of things to check out. Eddie says endorsing just provides a clear path to bias. It helps. Again, I don't hold the New Republic as a problem in this particular instance because I do think that their history is so clear and what direction they're coming at these topics in is so clear that that is useful. One of the things I say on this channel a lot, you've heard me say it a lot, is that I follow Fox and Vox. That it's useful to get the information as to how various folks are trying to spin specific things because you can better see the perspectives that they're putting forth. And the truth is somewhere in there, mostly, usually. Usually these outlets aren't operating on just object lies. They're taking some kernel of truth and they're spinning it in a direction that they think is useful to them. And so I do think that you could argue that the endorsements are useful because you know then that this newspaper in your town is always leaning towards the left. This newspaper in your town is always leaning towards the right. And I can take this story about break-ins in my city and understand what spin they're trying to put on that story. So there is usefulness potentially in knowing what direction people are coming from. But certainly from the Jeff Bezos perspective, it does tend to limit how people are understanding what they are reporting on as truth. Carrie says, I want to see all candidates speak contemporaneously without any out-of-bounds questions and without strict rules. See, I don't have a problem with folks putting limits on out-of-bounds questions and strict rules because, again, we come back to the trust of journalists kind of component. I don't trust you to not come up with a certain set of facts or some kind of strange road-mapped Illuminati conspiracy theory that I can't have anticipated, that in a live format I won't look dumb or otherwise hurt my chances of victory because you framed your particular question in this specific way. And so I do think that there is useful kind of control of the journalistic question asking component, but I understand wanting folks to be able to just speak in a room like a normal person, and that being an abject kind of lesson or virtue for electing them in a way that doesn't come across in a more controlled interview setting. All right, I know I saw one of these. Hang on, folks. I'm way back here. Emily D. Baker is in the chat. Thank you so much for giving 20 Hoeg Law memberships. Rob and Emily are being super generous today. I am so thankful for everybody that comes out and supports this channel. I am so happy to be able to get to have these conversations with you all so often. Thank you, Emily, for being here, for being in the chat, for gifting the Hoeg Law memberships. I am so appreciative of you. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to get over to your videos in the recent past because I've been so sick this last week and because I've been otherwise so busy. But I do get your email updates. I do get all of your live notices. I can't believe how much work you do, how much commentary you make on issues of so much importance. I'm so thankful that you are out there having those conversations about these issues when I'm certainly not able to do all of those topics that you do. And Rob does, to be quite frank. So thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Sandy for gifting 5 Hoeg Law memberships. I love it when this dog pops up. This profile image is always so adorable. Sandy, thank you so much. I can't comment on your video series like I did with Emily's just now, but I really appreciate the support for the channel. And I'm so, again, thankful that so many people want to have conversations like this one, because I can get, like anybody else, so kind of frustrated and upset at social media and the way people are talking over each other and otherwise not having conversations that I think need to be had, especially in the context of a U.S. presidential election. And it makes me so happy that I think we really can have reasonable minds differing in this space in a reasonable way and see each other as the human beings that we are, because that is most important at the end of the day. So thank you so much, Sandy. I really appreciate it. All right, folks. And with that said, I think we're coming to the end of our video. My voice is just about out of gas. But if you have any last comments, let me know. I did want to at least flag one other question for you all. Would you go, if you were Kamala Harris and you were deciding whether or not to go on what is at least partially a kind of hostile setting, not because Joe Rogan would necessarily be hostile, but because the audience is at least thought to be an audience that isn't inclined towards your policy positions, would you go? And if you would go, would you make extraordinary efforts to meet Joe Rogan where he lives, literally in this particular case, in Austin, to do a 3-hour interview? Would you make every effort to try to get on the show, or would you not do it? Would you essentially be the Harris campaign manager at this point saying it's not worth my time to do this? So thank you. Let me know. Witness also has a comment, says, take care of that voice, Hoeg. I have the same issue. It sucks. It's not ideal for someone that wants to talk for a living, whether on the phone and to my clients or to you all in video form. But I was a lot worse really recently. This is really the first possible time I could have even deigned to make a video like this one. So thank you, Witness. I really appreciate it. I hope you don't have the same issue for too long. It is that kind of time of year going into the fall and winter where this hits me quite often around my birthday, to be quite honest. It's no fun, but yeah. Llama Dungeon says, Emily, you're doing so much serious coverage. I appreciate it. She really is. Also, Emily, here's an entire stream just surrounding food-related lawsuits. Well, here's the thing, right? Emily D. Baker, I think she knows this. She's an entertainer as well as a commentator. I think we all are in this space. And I think some people can take that too far. Some people can do it in a biased way and get Jeff Bezos's ire in his editorial. But some people can just know, hey, you can only talk about murder and death and important stuff so much. You also have to have an entire video series on a lawsuit regarding candy corn, or whether or not the trademarks on a dog toy that also looks like a bottle of booze are something that should hold up as a problem for that particular dog toy manufacturer. I think you need to have these conversations because that helps get people invested in the topics that matter as much or more as those do. Virtual legality exists talking about pop culture and video games because I think you can have important discussions regarding contracts and statutes and statutory interpretation and all these various things we talk about in virtual legality in a context that maybe isn't as heavy or as important to you as you sit there living your life right now as it might be if we were to have that conversation only about Supreme Court cases and other things of that level of import. That was the design of it. Now, as it turns out, gamers, super, super passionate about, well, really everything. And so it maybe doesn't work out as perfectly that way as I would have it. But that was the idea. And so Emily D. Baker going out there talking about the Real Housewives, talking about food lawsuits, whatever else it may be, I think only really adds to the level of seriousness and importance that you can talk about really important things at because you've got that connection, because you've got that reasonable mind talking about things that are interesting and light as well as serious and important. Eddie says, I think any candidate needs to go. It's a 1-hour interview and she was 2 hours away. Well, I mean, it's a 3-hour interview if you do it for what Joe was asking for. Open conversation that isn't political. She could appeal to voters. I tend to agree that it would be good. I think that Joe would have been a pretty light touch in that context, again, because I think everything that is in that tweet and what I've seen of the clips of him suggests that he wants to be seen as a moderate voice. More than pushing one direction or the other. I can't promise you he would come across that way. Again, I don't watch him a ton, but I probably would have tried to go if I were Kamala Harris or her campaign manager. RJ says, well, I don't like Rogan, so I wouldn't just because of that, but I also don't think there's anything to gain. Rogan's audience aren't going to be swayed, so it would just be a waste of time. I think that is a reasonable position as well. And it looks like that's the one she's taken. We're not going to win that audience, so we're not going to go for it. But yeah, I mean, that's the problem with just counting on views, right? You can say, okay, it got 42 million views. Vance got 8 million views. Maybe Harris doesn't get that many views through the lens of Joe Rogan Experience, right? It could be that it's a good match for what his audience already is. When you talk about swaying people, moving them from one side of the aisle to the other, that may or may not happen. That's what campaign managers do, is they talk about what it is that you can actually achieve with your time and your money. And it could just be possible that they don't think that it's a useful amount of time or money to spend on somebody like Joe Rogan. S. Shar says it wouldn't hurt, but Joe Rogan shouldn't be so difficult knowing she's in the middle of a campaign. Again, like I said earlier in this video, that you don't owe somebody your vote. Certainly Joe Rogan doesn't owe somebody their platform. And so it's his loss if he doesn't get Kamala Harris on his platform to talk about important issues. I don't know that it's unfair for him to say, I want to do it my way. I don't know that he's being so difficult on this. Reasonable minds can differ on that. Traveling is a big deal. I am certainly sympathetic to anybody that has issues traveling. Famously, the commentator and former football coach John Madden, who was on Fox, I think, for decades talking about football, he would not fly anywhere. So they had commissioned for him a giant bus that took him to various places. Now, that's two sides realizing that they value each other and making it work. And do I think Joe Rogan and Kamala Harris could have made it work if they really wanted to? Yes. But it does seem from the outside looking in that Joe Rogan has a certain amount of power here and Kamala Harris has a certain amount of power here. And neither is inclined to believe that they benefit inordinately by working with the other in this particular context. So I don't know that it's so difficult as how I would frame this from Joe Rogan, but I don't think the asks from either side, at least as described to us today, are not overcomable if they thought that there was value to be had there. Emily D. Baker, food court is so educational. I agree with you, Hogla. I think it is educational, and I think all of the stuff that you do, Emily, is presented in the way that makes it approachable. I mean, we could do this as dry as possible, folks. We could talk about the driest legal issues in the world. It would be educational. It would be informational, but probably you, me, and the wall would be the only ones watching. And I do think that there is value in having entertainment with your education, with your information. I don't know that there's anybody that does it better than Emily. So thank you for being here, Emily. And thank you, everybody, for the support. Chicky L, member for 21 months. We love you, Rick. So grateful for you and your commentary. Thank you, Chicky L. And I'm gonna pretend that it is the cat that is actually Chicky L here. So thank you so much for figuring out how to type with those paws of yours. I really appreciate you as well. So thank you so much. Sandy, member for 8 months. Please take care of your voice. Feel better soon, Rick. Yeah, apologies for anybody that has listened to this and felt that it sounded really strained. I really hate that when I have to listen to that on a podcast or otherwise. So if you did feel that, I'm sorry. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. And I'm really glad that I got a chance to do this. We are coming up on the 90-minute mark, which is where I am comfortable closing the show out. So like Joe Rogan, and again, guys, get this video up to 42 million views. I know you can do it. It's going to be great. I'm going to close this video out, and I am so thankful for all of you for being here. Please do share it around. Do the YouTube things. Click the buttons, up votes, down votes. Everything's appreciated. Comments if you're coming in late on replay. I really appreciate all of it, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. I can't do any of this without all of you. Thank you.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.